Well, there are harsh words from Russia and Iran this Sunday. A joint statement says US strikes on a Syrian airbase, which killed at least 9 people, have crossed a red line. Now, that is according to Syrian state media. And it comes after activists reported at least 16 people were killed in US strikes on a town in the province of Idlib. Syrian and Russian planes have been conducting bombing raids in that area against what they call terrorists. Well, it is impossible for us to verify those reports from Idlib province, which is controlled by rebels, including jihadis linked to al-Qaeda. Well, for more on what's happening, senior international correspondent Paton Walsh is across the border in Istanbul, Turkey, and CNN's Phil Black joins us from Moscow. I want to go first to Nick. It was not that long ago that President Trump repeatedly said, as a candidate to become president, that the US should not attack Syria. That's all changed, and listening to the US envoy to the UN today, it seems we can expect more action, particularly when it comes to the future of the Syrian leader.
Possibly, although in truth, I think some of the messages here are mixed enough in the short term to suggest that maybe policy is being perhaps slowly, pragmatically put together, if I'm being generous, or made up on the fly if I'm not. The real issue here, I think, is how they've shifted from saying ISIS is their focus, and they perhaps considered some sort of broader entente that might allow Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, and Moscow to try and wrap things up in terms of the fight against the Syrian rebels. That appears to be upended by Donald Trump's very visceral, emotional reaction, understandably, at seeing children dying from twitching from nerve agent as a result of that attack on Khan Sheikhoun, the chemical weapon attack that resulted in the launching of those Tomahawk missiles. Now there appears to be a broader focus on what for Syria. But in truth, a lot of the ideas we're hearing are the same ideas the Obama administration were pursuing for many, many years with very little success. Here's what Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN, had to say to our Jake Tapper earlier.
Is regime change in Syria now the official policy of the United States?
So there's multiple priorities. It's getting Assad out is not the only priority. And so what we're trying to do is obviously defeat ISIS. Secondly, we don't see a peaceful Syria with Assad in there. Thirdly, get the Iranian influence out. And then finally move towards a political solution, because at the end of the day, this is a complicated situation. There are no easy answers, and a political solution is going to have to happen. But we know that it is not going to be, there's not any sort of option where a political solution is going to happen with Assad at the head of the regime. It just, if you look at his actions, if you look at the situation, it's going to be hard to see a government that's peaceful and stable with Assad.
Well, of course it's hard to, but is the position of the Trump administration that he cannot be ruler of Syria anymore? Regime change is the policy.
Well, the regime change is something that we think is going to happen because all of the parties are going to see that Assad's not the leader that needs to be taking place for Syria.
Now, it's a complicated situation. That's the phrase I think you can take away from that happening there. Bear in mind, too, the institutional memory of the administration, the Trump administration, pretty limited at this point. The State Department pared down to some degree. A lot of people there still working hangovers from the Obama administration, some too on the National Security Council. And it does appear, really, this is, to some extent, to the Trump insiders, a relatively new problem they're perhaps coming to terms with. What Nikki Haley was outlining there is the Geneva process, as it's called, now on its 5th stage, very unsuccessfully, all based on the premise, initially signed onto perhaps by Russia with vague wording, that a transitional government would eventually lead to Assad stepping aside from power. The wording was never that precise, but it's failed. Assad is in the military ascendancy, full stop. He's pushed the rebels back. The real issue now is if the US gets drawn more lengthily into this war, it's yet another new faction joining the fight between rebel and regime that has been the reason why this war keeps going on. Lynda, wars normally end because one side gets tired or runs out of people or runs out of money. In Syria, there's always a new faction joining either side, keeping it going. It may just be, if the US gets drawn into this more lengthily, that in fact they become yet another faction that perhaps breathes, sadly, new awful life into a war which had begun to look, awful as it was for rebels and civilians living in the areas they control, like it was possibly winding down or slowing to some degree. Lynda?
Yeah, certainly not slowing now, entering its 7th year there. Nick, just stand by for us. I want to go to Phil. This strike by the Trump administration on the Syrian airbase was the first intentional US strike on Assad forces since 2011. The move's been met with swift criticism by his allies, including Russia. What's the word there, Phil?
Lynda, in the same sense that Assad must go isn't a new idea for those opposed to Assad, Russia's response to that thinking isn't new either. Russia remains steadfast in its objection to the idea of outside actors, notably the West, especially the United States, having a say in who gets to rule Syria. The idea that changing the regime there is just simply unthinkable to Russia, especially in a country that is a long-standing Russian ally, long a part of Russia's sphere of influence. Russia has long been of the belief, and this is key to Russia's continuing support for Syria, long been of the belief that the United States has a habit in recent history of invading countries, kicking out leaders, trying to export democracy, often for trumped-up humanitarian reasons. This is the Russian view, I stress, and then often leaving chaos in its wake. It points to the Balkans, to Libya, to Iraq. It is determined not to let the same happen in Syria. And so what's changed in Syria? Well, what we've seen is the use of limited, focused military force by the American president against the Assad regime. That hasn't happened before. That gives Moscow and Damascus something to think about going forward. But at this stage, if that's the limit of the intervention, the limit of the pressure, it will do little to influence their behaviour significantly if you think about all they've been allowed to do in Syria since the start of the civil war. Lynda.
And Phil, the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is going to Moscow this week. In light of all that's happened, what can we expect?
Well, what we are hearing, I think, in the lead up to that visit, in the lead up to the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Italy over the next couple of days, would seem to be a renewed diplomatic hope that somehow the events of the last week, the chemical weapons incident, the American strike, that this somehow creates enough leverage to pressure Moscow to back away from Assad, to ease him out, to begin the transition that everyone has been talking about for so long. But that is, I stress, a hope. There does not seem to be any realistic reason to believe that that can be achieved in the immediate future, or that Moscow is about to drastically change its thinking. It has remained committed to Syria throughout the horrors of the war. It has used its own military to shape events on the ground to ensure the regime, if not Assad the man, then at least the regime, survives. So I just don't think you can overstate the point that Russia remains determined not to let the United States get its way in Syria, remains determined to see the Syrian regime survive. Lynda.
All right, thanks for that, Phil. Just back to Nick. President Trump now has to explain his action in targeting that Syrian airbase. He wrote a letter to Congress saying that the strike was meant to degrade the Syrian military's ability to conduct further chemical weapons attacks and to dissuade the Syrian regime from using or proliferating chemical weapons. While he has received criticism from the likes of Russia and Iran, there's certainly many critics that say those strikes didn't go far enough.
Well, yes, and the question you have to ask yourself here is how strong a message needs to be sent to be heard by the Syrian regime. Now, I think the mere fact that the Pentagon, that the White House was willing to cross that sort of red line in terms of their own psychology that Barack Obama wasn't willing to cross, and that's to use military force here, is a big signal enough. It says, look, we are willing to do this. Well, we haven't been for the past 5 or 6 years or so. That's a strong message in itself. The extent of damage to that airfield, well, we have to basically pass whether or not the Pentagon intended to render it disabled, whether it is actually functioning. We've heard reports of planes taking off. We've seen video of planes taxiing. We've seen video of comparatively lesser damage than you might have expected from 59 Tomahawk missiles slamming into an empty area. That's something for discussion. I think the broader problem that Trump faces now, President Trump faces now, is he's decided to use military force. The Syrian regime has seen this as the only military response they've had from the West for years and years of using bombs against hospitals, starve and surrender tactics, chemical weapons, you name it. The list of horrors, frankly, goes on all day. I could stand here for hours. That has been the only response so far, this Tomahawk cruise missile attack. Damascus may consider this to be a comparatively light response. They may feel emboldened. They may be emboldened by Russia and Iran, strong words in their support right now. And Trump may actually have to find himself drawn into the question of using military force again if yet another horror is committed, if potentially there's a response towards American assets somewhere in the region asymmetrically from many of the different proxies Syria or Iran actually have. And so I think this is the beginning potentially of an escalation that perhaps Barack Obama saw as likely and meant he kept well away from the Syrian conflict. and perhaps also to an increasingly lengthy period of being tested for the new Commander-in-Chief of American forces. Lynda?
All right, Nick, Paton, Walsh in Istanbul for us, and Phil Black in Moscow. Great to have you both with us. Thank you.